Greetings. I'm Chaplain Ed Fielding with the Maryland National Guard. I'm here to provide a brief discussion on the book of Job. Many familiar with the Bible know that Job is a story of suffering. The suffering of a righteous man, which for all intents and purposes, there's no real explanation for what he went through other than that we live in a fallen world and we do not know the plan of a sovereign, all-powerful God of the universe. But we can learn from this story that through our faith, God will lead us to his mercy. The book of Job addresses human pain, but it never deals with questions such as why is suffering this hard or why is it this long? We're in a period of trial right now, one that's proved to be hard for most of us as our daily life has been altered. In some cases, it's much harder for those who've suffered sickness from this disease, from this virus, or even felt the pain of losing a loved one during this time. The story of Job opens with another worldly conversation between God and Satan. It's one we can't comprehend, where the Lord asks Satan, "From where have you come?" And Satan responds that he had been going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down on it. Strange kind of discussion that we don't often see in the Bible between God and Satan, but it demonstrates Satan's lack of transcendence. Basically, the Lord can be in all places at once, but Satan's nature is not one of that. He can't be in all places at once. And unexplainably, God seems to offer up Job to Satan by asking him, "Have you considered my servant Job?" I guess as you're walking along the earth. There's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. The book presents the reader with this supernatural illustration of this dynamic between God and Satan. We don't often see this, as I mentioned, and it offers this immediate intrigue. It immediately pulls you in. There are mysterious things going on here, far beyond our knowledge when it comes to the nature and actions of God. And next, and quite fitting, we receive confirmation from the Almighty that his servant Job was indeed a righteous man, where God states that Job is a blameless and upright man, leading us to that age-old question, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do humans suffer? Why do children suffer? Why do animals suffer? Why does the innocent suffer? Why are we going through, as a world, what we are today, currently? Particularly at this time of uncertainty about our future, this book addresses some fitting questions, these particular fitting questions that we may be asking at this time. And how we respond to these trials and uncertainties, we're given, it's sort of opened up as we go through this story of Job. And we see how Job responds. Two verses we're going to cover today in this discussion are the well-known Job 1:21 through 22, where after he loses his possessions, many of his possessions, his servants, and even his children, Job responds by stating, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." This is said by Job at the beginning of the story, even after he loses his livestock and servants and children, as mentioned. And then the second verse we consider will be towards the end of the story in Job 42:5, where he says, "I heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you." These two verses offer like a bookend to this story. And this second verse is stated by Job at the end. And this is a point where he comes to a deeper understanding of God and his relationship with him, which is one grounded in trust, truth, and obedience. Throughout the rest of the story of Job, he faces a second round of suffering. The first round was his children and his possessions. And but the second round is where Satan challenges God to stretch out his hand and touch his skin and flesh. We see this in verse 2:5, stating that he will then curse God. As if losing his livelihood and children were enough, Satan assumes now that if Job himself is affected, surely then he will lose faith and curse God. And as verse 2:10 states, "In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." For a good portion of the rest of the book, we're met with the reactions of those close to Job, such as his wife in verse 2:9, who says, to go curse God and die. Things must have been pretty bad, which obviously they were, but they had to have been awfully bad to lead this righteous man's wife to this conclusion. In fact, just by reading this ancient story, we can't truly grasp the suffering and torment Job is going through. And it brings some level of perspective when considering the things we might go through today in our modern world. The story of Job may be one of the oldest in the Bible, possibly as far back as the time of the Tower of Babel. We have so many resources to turn to today in times of trouble, in this country in particular. How would it have been for Job? He was a man of wealth, and so he had connections to wealth and friends and family that others didn't. But he began losing much of that, and his friends turned on him. Even in this, Job maintained his faith in God. Job's friends all felt he must have done something wrong to deserve this, though. He must have sinned, they felt. His friend Eliphaz counseled Job to turn from his sin and ask for forgiveness in verse 28. His friend Bildad counsels him to seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy in verse 8:5. And his friend Zophar tells Job he deserves worse, stating that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves in verse 11:6. His friends heap on Job this dogmatic belief in retribution, meaning that since Job was suffering as he was, he must have done something to deserve it. Yet we see that God himself expresses Job's righteousness. And it opens up this future glimpse of the coming Messiah in this, where Jesus was a pure and sinless lamb going through the worst possible death for the sins of the world. But unlike Christ, Job is sinful. He's a broken human. And we see this in his defense of himself. Job was righteous and he knew it. He was right about his character, though, but his friends were wrong about God's purposes and will. At least his three friends discussed here were. All of this we see culminate in God's powerful and poetic dressing down of Job in the climax, where he asks the questions, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Has the rain a father who has begotten the drops of dew? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds that a flood of waters may cover you? Who provides the raven its prey? Do you give the horse his might? Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars? We see in the opening verses of God's interaction with Satan, when we go back, and the suffering and torment of a righteous man of God, the tragedies seem inexplicable to us. But yet they may be used by the sovereign, all-wise God to accomplish his good purposes, which sometimes remain unknown to us. As the Apostle Paul tells the Ephesians, God works on all things according to the counsel of his will, Ephesians 1:11, and will work all things for good for those who love him, Romans 8:28. Folks, we're asking why bad things happen to us today. But this same question was asked and answered here in this story hundreds or centuries ago. And we see in the New Testament in John 9:12, the disciples asked a man born blind, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he has this affliction? And Jesus responded, it was not this man who sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Verse 9:3. The New Testament makes it clear that suffering is inevitable in a fallen world. And no matter how or why it comes, it does not have the power, though, to separate the believer from God's love. Nor does it have the power to thwart God's purposes for the individual or God's broader redemptive purposes in this world. And this brings some perspective to our own suffering today in this world. This is what Job learns here from God and what we can learn from this passage. God is free to rule this world as he will, and that we as humans must acknowledge our inability to fully grasp God's work and purposes. But even in the midst of life's trials, we must continue to revere God have faith in him for who he is, not because of what we receive from him. No matter what we're going through right now, we can rest assured in the truth that God will be displayed in our struggles. Even in the most vile moment in history, as Christ took on the sins of the world in death, our sins were nailed to the cross so that we could receive everlasting life. Folks, even in the worst of circumstances, God's sovereign purposes will shine through. And it may not be at that moment, but in the hindsight of his fingerprints we see left behind, we see that in all of this, he lives. And we live to be in relationship with him and experience the life he gives us. Not always on a beach or in a big house. And sometimes we're confined to our houses or certain places we are now. But in the most valuable thing imaginable, his love. Blessings to you all. And may God shine upon you. Thank you. Have a good day.